So, believe it or not, I had a choice this week about our first reading, and I still went with this one from First Thessalonians. In this reading, St. Paul describes what has commonly come to have been called in the church the second coming, and what eventually, though really only in the last 200 years or so, has become called the rapture. This reading has given birth to all kinds of terrible fiction, the Left Behind series among them, and lots of fiction masquerading as theology, that so-called rapture. What I want to spotlight today, though, is that it's important to remember that these words from First Thessalonians are meant to be a word of hope, not fear. I went to seminary with some folks from evangelical and Pentecostal communities, and almost all of them had a story about coming home someday to find that their parents had left and thinking that they had been left behind. But again, this is not a passage about separation, but about reunion and healing. In fact, the more that I read the letters of St. Paul, the more struck I am by how all of his letters, as terrible as some of them sound to modern ears and as terrible as they have been used by the church, are about expressing care and concern about churches and communities that he loves deeply. What he wants to do, above all things, is to give the people he is writing to the word that they need to keep going in their time and place. In Thessalonica, the community we know had undergone some kind of terrible trauma, although we're not sure exactly what. Many of them thought the second coming was, like next Tuesday, and yet people in their community had died. So what would happen to them, the remaining members wondered? Were they cut off from the kingdom of heaven? No, Paul says, and emphatically. In fact, what he's saying to them is that the boundaries that they think matter, the divisions of the world that they live with, the distinctions that they hold so dear, will fall away completely when Christ comes again. And that most difficult boundary, the boundary between the living and the dead, that boundary will be wiped away entirely. In fact, it may be the least meaningful of all. This may be a good word for our time and place, a time when divisions seem harder and harder to transcend, a week in which it has felt like something cataclysmic is just around the corner. But truly, our questions are just a little bit different from those of the Thessalonians. In the centuries after Paul, as the years rolled by and the second coming kept getting rescheduled, our questions as a church, as a community, have shifted. Our church has come to accept wholeheartedly the theology that Paul gives us in this passage. We grieve when people die, and Paul is not saying that grief is unchristian, but we grieve like people who have hope. Hope in a final resurrection day where we will all be reunited with Christ and with one another. We worry a little bit less about our beloved dead and quite a bit more about, well, how then shall we live, in the words of the gospel? What are we who are waiting supposed to be doing? Another perhaps very relevant question for this week. And while I have to admit it, your transition as a community was not top of mind when I was writing this yesterday, but it's no less salient. You are in, as Diane reminded us at the beginning of this service, an interval period, a time of waiting. So what about it? What shall we do while we wait? More help for this question might be found in Matthew's gospel this week. And although this too is a parable that has been weaponized, used to draw strong distinction between the wise and the foolish, who's in and who's out, this text really is not about that either. This parable is a part of a longer collection in the 24th and 25th chapters of Matthew. All these parables about waiting, about how Jesus has promised and will come to us again. Unfortunately for your preacher, this is one of the more difficult ones to interpret. Centuries of Christian commentators have wondered, what exactly is the oil supposed to symbolize? You can read lots of commentaries where people have carefully constructed perfect metaphors that fall completely to the ground as soon as you continue on in the gospel. The real answer as to what this oil is probably that it's different for each of us and in every age. What we can say is that there's a very strong connection to be drawn between this passage and the ending of the Beatitudes. Unfortunately, a couple of verses that got dropped by the lectionary last week. After all those blessings that Anne so beautifully illustrated for us, after all those beautiful words, Jesus wraps it up by saying, "You are salt and you are light. You are the light of the world, and you must let your light shine before others, not for your own glory, but for the glory of God in heaven. You are the light of the world," which means that you have to take responsibility for keeping your lamp lit, not just for yourself, but for the glory of God in heaven and for the help and encouragement of the rest of us. So I wonder, for you, in this time and in this place, what is it that keeps your lamp lit? What is the fuel that helps you shine your light out for others to see? What is it that replenishes your soul and your spirit, that nourishes your mind and body? What is it that, unfortunately, no one else can pour into you? No one else but God. I think the wise bridesmaids in this story come off as pretty petty when they say, "No, we can't give you any of our oil." But what if all they're doing is setting a good, healthy boundary or acknowledging a reality that really only you can fill your own lamp? And here's the thing, there is no shame in having your oil be a little low this week of all weeks. One commentator pointed out that it's actually not so much the lack of oil that means that these foolish bridesmaids get shut out when the bridegroom comes. There's no distinction. The bridegroom throws open the doors and just says, "Everybody come on in." It might be that they left that ultimately excludes them from the kingdom. They left, they disengaged. They fell prey to this narrative that if your oil is a little bit low, you can just go buy some from the merchant down the street. They went off in search for oil in other places. And yes, sometimes your lamp is low and it is hard to shine out into the world. But even in those times, even in those difficulties, I think it's just fine to sit and bask in the glow of someone else's lamp. That's why God places us in families, nurtures us in friendships, and feeds us in the community of the church. So that when one of us is feeling a little dim, in whatever way you want to take that word, the rest of us, or others of us, can lighten the scene. Did you notice that in that first reading? That's actually how Paul ends this story of the second coming. People get so caught up in the dramatic imagery and the trumpet sounding and the archangels and all the stuff flying up in the air that we sometimes lose that very last sentence. Paul's advice to this community, rent by trauma and waiting with bated breath on the coming of Christ, just this: encourage one another. Encourage one another. Go ahead and grieve, but don't forget to hold up the lamp of hope for one another. Don't give up, don't despair, and above all, do not disengage, even if the waiting seems endless and seems fruitless. This week, I want to leave you with similar words. I want to encourage you. First, to find some time, today, tomorrow, and the next day, to check in on yourself. Turn off the TV, the radio, whatever you're listening to, and tune into what's happening in your own life. in your own lamp. If your oil is a little bit low, what might you do to replenish it? And if your oil is full, what might you do to shine a little light out into the world so that others can see just a little bit better? I want to encourage you above all else to stay engaged. Do not fall into that trap of nihilism that says we should just throw up our hands and give up. Do not abandon the faith that is yours in Christ. Do not let the divisions of this world, even the boundary between the living and the dead, discourage your hope, snuff out your faith, or allow you to be pulled away from the people who sustain you. Stick around, stay engaged, because we are all invited to that banquet, to that holy feast. And if you leave, the rest of us would miss your unique and powerful light at that great rejoicing that we know is to come. Amen.